Well, today's lecture we're going to be talking about the politics of the 1850s and why the politics of the 1850s break down that lead us to civil wars. And it's a very complicated story and a very long, complex one, but I'm going to break it down for you into these 4 steps. One was the idea of the slave power conspiracy, which I briefly discussed in the last lecture. And the correlative of the slave power conspiracy idea, and that's the idea among Southerners that there was a conspiracy against them and their rights, and that conspiracy was located in the Republican Party. And they called it black republicanism. Black as in evil and cruel, and also black as in sympathetic to black people instead of white people. So, in other words, these attitudes develop in the 1840s and 50s, in which more and more Americans become convinced that there's a conspiracy against their rights by a small and powerful group. But there were kind of 2 opposite stories about how this conspiracy works and who's a member of it that lead to these irreconcilable positions where Southerners and those against the expansion of slavery in the North have almost completely opposite, not just opinions on that issue, but completely opposite opinions about how politics in America works by the 1850s. And one of the results is a breakdown of the political system. If you don't trust it, if you think the other side is not only mistaken, but completely nefarious and desirous of the destruction of your liberties, then the political system really can't work. And this goes beyond the kind of partisan antagonism that we're used to something that makes it so that the political system is impossible. More about that. The second thing that happens is I'm going to talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin and the Future of the Slave Act. Now, both of those things are consequences, and they're consequences of the Compromise of 1850. So we'll have to set up that discussion a little bit by talking about the Compromise of 1850. But really, both of these things lead to the sort of almost paranoia. I'm not sure that's quite the right term, but that sense of oppression and conspiracy that I talked about when we talked about the slave power conspiracy. And again, these consequences of the Compromise of 1850 point in opposite directions. Uncle Tom's Cabin, as you probably know, is this novel about slavery, this great anti-slave novel. And it is a great novel. It serves to foment Northern public opinion against slavery. Future of the Slave Act, on the other hand, which starts out as a Southern victory, or it seems like that at first, really does quite a bit to convince Southerners that Northerners are not interested in obeying the law if it pertains to slavery, and are therefore interested in making Southerners second-class citizens with limited rights. So I want to talk about that in more detail. Then the Kansas-Nebraska Act and its consequences. Kansas-Nebraska Act passes in 1854. It's subsequent. This lecture is pretty much in chronological order. Subsequent to these other things, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, you can make the case, is the single biggest thing in the 1850s that caused a rift between North and South, and has very, very dire consequences for the Democratic Party, for trust between North and South, for the state of Kansas, for the political career of Stephen Douglas, the author of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It's really a disaster all around. There's very little good that comes out of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And then finally, the last thing we're going to talk about is the meaning of the Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision comes out in 1857, and the timing of it is particularly unfortunate. And it more than anything, I think, seals the opinions of Northerners and Southerners that the political system's irretrievably broken. So that by the election of 1860, by the time Abraham Lincoln's elected, you have an entire section of the country that has completely lost faith in politics and thinks that the American system is completely broken. And once you've reached that conclusion, the decision to secede from the Union becomes easy, because it's not just that your side lost an election; it's that the political system itself is aligned against you. It's a very different interpretation of events, and we'll get to that in due course. Okay, themes today. Between the Mexican War and the election of 1860, that was between 1848. We talked about the election of 1848, the Free Soilers and everything already. The question of slavery's expansion becomes the overriding political issue in America and destroy the second party system. And that's absolutely true. The Whig Party ceases to exist. The Democratic Party splits in two in 1860. And we have a new politics, the politics of Jacksonian America, the politics based on this question of economic development, what the government's role should be. That disappears. It's destroyed by the slavery issue. And it's not unreasonable to say that the Civil War is a consequence of the destruction of the second party system. Anyway, second theme is more and more Americans become convinced that either slave power conspiracy or black republicanism, and in a sense these are the same type of phenomenon. They're both the deep-rooted conviction that there's a conspiracy at the highest level, that the federal government is controlled by conspiracies, essentially. Anyways, more and more Americans become convinced that one of these exists. It was out to subvert their rights. The country moved closer and closer to civil war. All right, so let's get back to the slave power conspiracy. And here's a slide we've seen before of this slave power rally in Dorchester, Massachusetts. Free Soil Party rally in Dorchester, Massachusetts. Free soil, free labor, free speech. And I told you before that the Free Soilers make the case that free soil, that is soil, land free from slavery, and free labor, that is, capitalist labor as we perceive it, are absolutely necessary for freedom. That they believed that slave labor drives out free labor, that slave labor makes free labor impossible, and eventually creates a society in which everyone is either enslaved or a slave master. They believed that the South was conspiring to destroy American liberties, that powerful Southern slaveholders had too much sway in government, particularly the federal government, and that they were conspiring to impose a slave society upon all of America, not just upon the South, and that free speech was absolutely necessary to unveil this conspiracy to the American public. So the Free Soil Party kind of creates, or presents, I should say, this theory of how politics works, what the role of slavery is, and why people should pay attention to this issue. Another way to put this is that the Free Soil Party makes the slavery issue not an issue about black people and morality, but about white people and liberty. That slavery becomes not just an immoral thing that's terrible and that you should feel bad about. It becomes something that threatens the liberties of your children if you're white. So it makes the issue, it's really brilliant politics, because it makes the issue one of self-interest, not one of generosity and selflessness, which doesn't affect people nearly as much. So the Free Soilers create this kind of full theory of how American politics is working. And what happens in the 1850s is that more and more people become convinced that this Free Soil version of ideas is actually true. And we'll lay out how that happens over the course of the lecture, at least to try to get partway there. I showed you this before as well. The notion of a slave power conspiracy. This is supposed to be revealed how American politics truly works, the secret and formidable power of slaveholders who manipulate things to attain the ends of the slave power. More and more people present the idea that this is how American politics truly works. Look at the presidency of the United States, they'll say. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, Andrew Jackson, all the way up through Zachary Taylor, overwhelmingly they're Southern slaveholders. What does that tell you about how way power really works in America? Now, Southerners dispute this. They say, look, the South was always in danger of becoming a permanent minority. We're a permanent minority in the House of Representatives. We're barely hanging on in the Senate. How can you say that Southerners are the true power in America? Well, the slave power conspiracy believes it's the case and that it's getting worse. So, this kind of discourse, this kind of conversation becomes normal in America in the 1850s. We'll skip over that. We've seen that already as well. Now, here's the opposite. Here is, this is a Democratic newspaper in Pennsylvania, but it echoes what you're hearing all over the South by the 1850s, that black republicanism is the true conspiracy in America. The Republican Party forms in 1854. We'll look at that a little further on in the lecture. But Southerners say, well, what the virtue of the Republican Party is that it finally puts this anti-Southern conspiracy out in the open. These people who love black people and think black people are more important than white people. These people who are trying to destroy the South, trying to destroy the liberties of Southerners, through their own conspiratorial means. That's the Republican Party. So black republicanism, the idea, in other words, that there's a conspiracy against the liberties of the South by these fanatical abolitionists, that becomes the kind of Southern parallel to the slave power conspiracy. And as these mentalities expand in America, the ability to compromise through politics disappears, because neither one of these visions is about politics or compromise. They both view the situation in the 1850s in terms of absolutes. Furthermore, there are no adherents of the idea of a slave power conspiracy in the South. None. Just as there are very few adherents, some Democrats, who believe in this abolitionist conspiracy in the North. And the result of not having, neighbors who disagree with you, that you say, well, my neighbor's a reasonable person, but she's somebody whose politics I think are incorrect, but she's still, wonderful and, is very good about cutting her lawn and making sure that, the street stays clean and, she's really nice. We just disagree about politics. The ability to see the other side, in other words, as reasonable, decent human beings becomes much more difficult when there are none of them around. Then it becomes much easier to see them as all these crazy people who are, who are either evil or stupid and that you can't trust and they really have to be crushed. That kind of mentality becomes much, much easier when you're not face-to-face with the people you oppose. And that's another phenomenon that's happening in the 1850s. It makes the coming of the Civil War that much easier. All right. Now let's talk about politics. We got up to 1848 in the last lecture, in the election of 1848, and Zachary Taylor wins the election of 1848. And he wins on this platform of trying to avoid the slavery issue, as has his Democratic opponent. So the election's over. The Wilmot debate has... It's not really a thing of the past, but it's ignored for the moment by powerful people in Congress, and it seems to American politicians that these heated exchanges have cooled off a little bit, and we're going to have a period of calming, and we can, cooler heads can prevail, and we can, resolve these issues through compromises we had through, the creation of the Constitution and the Missouri Compromise, that politicians had always found a way around the slavery issue, and we'd probably be able to do so again. But that doesn't turn out to be the case in 1848. And that's because California becomes an issue much, much faster than anybody had expected. California is relatively unpopulated during the Mexican War. Seems like it's going to be a long way until it becomes a state, but something unexpected happens, and that is the gold rush. As those of you who follow the National Football League know, the San Francisco football team's called the San Francisco 49ers. They're called the 49ers because in 1849, gold is discovered in California, and the gold rush starts in 1849, and suddenly everybody wants to move to California. Everybody who's ambitious and young and hungry and wants to make their fortune heads off to California, including, by the way, a guy named Frederick Billings, who was a graduate of the University of Vermont. He goes to San Francisco and makes his fortune, becomes a wealthy man, later becomes a railroad magnate, and he comes back to Vermont after he makes his money out west, and in his loyalty and generosity to the university, he just gives UVM $100,000 to build a magnificent new library, and that's the Billings Library at UVM. Anyway, there's this gold rush in California in 1849, and for our purposes, that means that the population of California goes up very, very quickly. Everybody rushes to California in the gold rush, and the result is California's population rises to the point where it can apply for statehood very, very quickly. California is ready to apply for statehood by 1850 and applies for statehood in 1850. And now we've got a problem, because when California applies for admission in 1850, it applies for admission to the Union as a free state. And there's no slave state to balance it off. Now, until 1850, they'd always found a way to balance the number of slaves in free states, but if California joins the Union as a free state, that means that the South is going to be a minority, not only in the House of Representatives, based on its relatively small population, but also in the United States Senate. That the South is therefore always going to be able to be outvoted by the North. And this causes a lot of consternation in the South. Another way to think of this is, after only this 2-year respite, or less than 2-year respite, between the election of after the election of 1848, suddenly the slavery issue has reared its head again in the form of the question of admitting California. So, what can be done? Well, the South can't permanently block the admission of California as a state in the Union, but it can certainly set up roadblocks to its admission in 1850, and this causes a congressional a crisis, crisis of 1850, and so there is an attempt to compromise, to give the South something in return for the admission of California. And that something is a strengthened Fugitive Slave Act. There'd been a Fugitive Slave Act on the books. The that it was legal to go retrieve your runaway slaves if they run away to free states, for example. But it was a weak law, and as the price for acquiescing in the admission of California, Southerners in the United States Senate demand a strengthened Fugitive Slave Act. So they do strengthen the Fugitive Slave Act, or propose it, wrap it in with the admission of California in a nice package, present it to the Senate, and it fails. That bill fails. It fails because there are Northerners in favor of the admission of California who cannot stomach the idea of a new Fugitive Slave Act, and there are Southerners who are not willing to concede, even though they favor a Fugitive Slave Act, they're not willing to concede creating a permanent Southern minority. So there are enough hardliners on either side to vote against this bill so that it fails to pass. So then what? Okay. Then what is the compromise is broken up into pieces, so that all the Northerners in favor of the admission of California join forces with some border state Southerners who favor compromise, and the compromise in Northern vote is enough to admit California. Then the question of Fugitive Slave Act comes up. All the Northerners can vote against it in good conscience, except for some that favor compromise, and they are enough with Southerners to form a majority to pass the Fugitive Slave Act. So we have, in the case of the Compromise of 1850, California admitted. There's some bordered areas with Texas that are settled as well, and we have the creation of a strengthened Fugitive Slave Act. But the Compromise of 1850 fails, and here's why. It wasn't a compromise. And this is what I mean by that. It wasn't a compromise because nobody had to compromise. People in the North can say, I voted for the admission of California, and I also voted against this horrible Fugitive Slave Act. I'm a good congressman. Most people, except for a handful of compromisers, voted the way their constituents wanted on both issues. Same thing with Southerners. I voted against California. I voted for the Fugitive Slave Act. I'm a good, strong Southerner. I didn't compromise with the enemies of the South. So the Compromise of 1850 really isn't a compromise. It's a series of votes in which most people take hardline positions and a tiny handful of compromisers vote for everything. But for most people, it's not a compromise. So, in other words, most people don't say, I gave up something to get something. This isn't, I had to hold my nose during this to favor this deal, but, here I am favoring it. It's not a compromise. It was a bit of legislative trickery that doesn't really force most people to compromise. So, that leads us to 2. It did not resolve any of the underlying issues. There's no kind of grand compromise about slavery. There's no kind of grand compromise about the question of Wilmot, whether slavery should be allowed in these new territories. There's no discussion of, the future of slavery in new states. Nothing like that. None of these underlying issues are resolved at all. If anything, they're worsened by the Compromise of 1850. Not resolved. And then thirdly, the Fugitive Slave Act inflames Northern public opinion. So let's get to that. Okay, the Fugitive Slave Act does a couple of things. One is that it makes it easier to go recapture slaves. Well, how does it do that? One of the ways it does that is to it sets up special courts for fugitive slave cases. That somebody gets arrested as a runaway slave, and they get taken to this federal magistrate. And of course they say, well, I'm not the person that this is a mistake, case of mistaken identity. I'm free. Well, before photography and fingerprinting and everything, it's very, very difficult to identify a person if they're denying that they're that person. So the slave owners say, "This is my runaway slave, George," and I recognize him. That's George, all right. And George says, "Oh, I know. My name is Joseph. This is a big mistake. They can't prove that I'm his runaway slave." So how is that resolved? Well, the Fugitive Slaves Act says we're going to resolve it in special courts. But it also does something else that inflames Northern opinion. It says that the magistrates of these special courts are repaid twice. They get paid $5 when they say resolve the case in favor of the person accused of being the runaway slave, and they get $10 when they resolve it in favor of the aggravated slaveholder. So there's an incentive built into the system to say, oh, yeah, these people must be runaway slaves, and they are going to be returned to the South. Another thing the Fugitive Slave Act does is that it makes Northerners complicit in the return of fugitive slaves to the South. That there's no kind of local veto where you can get a jury together and say, we're not going to stand for this, we're not going to allow for this. The federal arm supersedes that, and the government can come and snatch people. And now, in effect, this doesn't happen, except in a few very famous cases. But the idea that you local people who despise slavery in some northern place can't do anything about the recapture of a fugitive slave, that really upsets people. And then the final thing the Fugitive Slave Act does is it brings the reality of slavery and the recapture of people. It makes it real for Northerners. There are a couple of famous cases, the Anthony Burns case in Boston, for example, where this fugitive slave is recaptured and then he's brought back to a ship in Boston Harbor to be shipped back south, and giant crowds surround who are upset about this, and they have to surround this fugitive slave with 300 armed men to get him safely to this ship because there's going to be a riot to free him, and the people of Boston have soldiers in the street pointing guns at them just because they oppose slavery. It makes slavery and the power of the South more real than anything else had been hitherto. That before then, discussion of slavery had been abstract to most people in a place like Boston, but suddenly it becomes real as a result of the Fugitive Slave Act, and it convinces many people that there is such a thing as the slave power conspiracy, and that slavery does rule America. Otherwise, how could this have happened? So the fugitive slave law seems like a Southern victory at first. We're going to have a stronger fugitive slave law. The federal government has come down on the side of recapturing slaves. We're kind of showing that slaves are property, that the Southern interpretation of slaves as property is the one that the federal government endorses. Seems like a victory. But what its net effect is, it doesn't recapture that many slaves, and instead it inflames many, many people in the North against slavery. So here's an example from Boston of a sign saying "Watch out for kidnappers and slaves." Slave catchers that the police of Boston are now empowered and in fact ordered by the federal government to recapture you, and that this is a terrible thing. Here's a notice again in Boston, Faneuil Hall. Big public meeting about a man who'd been kidnapped. Now, the Southern interpretation is he's not kidnapped. He's a runaway slave. He's somebody's property, somebody's valuable property that needs to be repatriated to his owner. And you can't call this kidnapping. If your cow runs away and you go get it back from somebody who's keeping it, does that make you a kidnapper? I mean, that's crazy. So again, these kind of opposing interpretations of events and of principles really becomes quite severe in the 1850s. Okay, and that leads us to Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe, she's Lyman Beecher's daughter, as you may recall. Harriet Beecher Stowe gets inspired. In fact, she says Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by God. She gets inspired to write this novel in reaction to the Fugitive Slave Act. And it's about slaves, and it's about running away from slavery and the moral imperative to do so, and how terrible and awful slavery is, and how we should all sympathize with the slaves and not the slave masters. And it's a very, very powerful book. If you haven't read it, it really is a great book. It's sentimental. The characters are all either good guys or bad guys. There's very little ambiguity or complexity to it in a lot of ways. Nevertheless, its Victorian sentimentality is over the top. All those things are true. Nevertheless, it's a great book. And Stowe starts a phenomenon. She writes this book. It starts out in serial form. It comes out in magazines and issue by issue, and every chapter comes out in sequence, and lots of cliffhangers in this book. You're always waiting to see what's going to happen next. So it becomes a publishing phenomenon. Then it comes out as a book in 1852, and as a novel. It's the Harry Potter of its day. It's this incredible bestseller, and nothing's ever sold like it. It's second only to the Bible in the number of copies printed. It's an incredible phenomenon, and Uncle Tom's Cabin, more than anything else, it's likely turns Northern public opinion, particularly Northern female public opinion, against slavery. It's a woman's book, and a big theme in this book is motherhood. And she really hammers home, and she's not subtle about it or shy about saying it, that slave mothers have the same feeling for their children as white free mothers do in the North. And as mothers and as women, free women should sympathize with the plight of slave women. And it's very effective. She really pulls out all the stops, and I think it's very effective. Here's one of the climactic scenes of the book, and this is a great illustration of this point I was just making. This is the slave Eliza. Eliza lives in Kentucky, and she finds out that her family is going to be sold and split up, and she has to run away from the slave dealer. And she runs to the Ohio River, because on the other side of the Ohio River is Ohio, which is a free state. And it's March, or say, and the ice on the river's breaking up, but Eliza's desperate. She snatches up her baby in her arms, and then she runs across the Ohio River, jumping from ice floe to ice floe. Any mistake is going to mean instant death as she, drowns in the freezing water, and so will her child. But she has to take this horrible risk, and she makes it all the way across and makes it to Ohio. And then she knocks, she's freezing, her kid is wet and cold and hungry, and, she's desperate, and she knocks on this house door. And by great good fortune, the family inside is kind-hearted and good. And the mother of the house is this good Bible reading woman, and takes Eliza in and helps her as mother to mother, and Stowe absolutely hammers home that theme, and it's effective, and that's what I mean by this being a woman's book. That women read it. The audience is Northern white women. Thousands and thousands of them read it, and they come out feeling that slavery is a horrible thing, and they should fight against it as a result of reading Uncle Tom's Cabin. All right, so as the 1850s commence, we get this compromise that isn't a compromise. We get inflamed feelings due to the Fugitive Slave Act and Uncle Tom's Cabin. And now we're going to get back to politics, because in 1854 there's another disastrous event that has to do with slavery. Though when it starts out, you'd think it's the furthest thing at all to do with slavery. So let's look at the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, in its intent, is about railroads. Here we have the railroad system in 1860. We can actually, look at it more in 1850, the red one. You see a fairly complete railroad system in the Northeast as far west as Pittsburgh, but then it gets very spotty west of Pittsburgh. Lots of construction between 1850 and 1860, as you can see from the purple here. But the railroad lines end in Missouri. St. Joseph, Missouri is the furthest place that there's a railroad line. I guess Houston, but that's a little spur from the ocean into little bit into Texas. The last place on the grid is St. Joseph, Missouri. But after the Mexican War, that is after 1858, the United States is now a transcontinental nation. It goes all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The railroad system doesn't match it. It's inadequate to the needs of the country as of 1850. Well, that leads us, and take a good look, by the way, to Illinois. You can see St. Louis, which borders Illinois, except for a bend in the Mississippi River, is practically in Illinois, and Chicago are two of the most important rail hubs. And that's why they're big cities, in fact. And you can see the lines from St. Joseph, Missouri, go either to St. Louis or to Chicago. So Illinois is absolutely crucial as the kind of westernmost end of this rail grid. Okay, that leads us to Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas was senator from Illinois in the 1850s. He was a very, very able politician. He was still a young man in the 1850s. He was born in 1813. He was a legislative dynamo. His nickname was the Little Giant. He was a short guy. He was only 5'4". That's the little part, but he was a giant in terms of oratory and legislative ability. And he was also gigantic in terms of ambition. So Stephen Douglas, by the 1850s, wants to be president. And there's no reason to think that he can't be. He is, as I said, a very, very able politician. He's one of the leaders, if not the leader of his party, the Democratic Party in the Senate. He's a national figure. He's an impressive guy. So Douglas wants to be president, and he wants an issue. He wants an issue not to divide the country, but to make him popular. And what he chooses, and it's, in many ways, it's a very, very astute choice. What he chooses is to be the champion of a transcontinental railroad. We're going to link the country together with this great technology. We're going to join the West and the East together, and blah, 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 blah. And incidentally, we're going to do it through Illinois. In other words, what he wants to do is he wants to build a railroad from the Midwest all the way to San Francisco. And this great transcontinental railroad will, make, instead of having to take a boat all the way to California or, be in some kind of wagon train or something and face the dangers of the West and going through the Rocky Mountains and all that stuff, we're going to have a railroad. It's going to link the country together. It's going to be good for trade. All of these arguments we've heard before. And it's going to, through the miracles of modern technology, you'll be able to get from Chicago to San Francisco in a matter of a few days. But like Henry Clay before him, Stephen Douglas says, the government is going to have a role in this. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act is a step to building a transcontinental railroad, one that Stephen Douglas has every expectation will be a huge success and will put him in the position to become president in 1856, say. Well, it goes wrong. So let's get how it goes wrong. Here is a map we've looked at before when we talked about the Compromise of 1850 and admission to California of the states and territories of the United States up and through 1854. Well, Douglas wants to build a railroad to go from California to Illinois, or to Missouri if you prefer. And to have that happen, that railroad is necessarily going to have to pass through unorganized territory. You can see that on all unorganized territory north of Texas. That's the remaining territory from the Louisiana Purchase. Nobody living there yet, except for some Native Americans. No governments. It's unorganized. Well, to build the railroad through that territory, it's going to have to be organized first. It's just a technical step in getting that railroad built. It's a necessary step. You have to have a government, and the government will have to allocate, land to the railroads, and Congress has to do this. So that's all the Kansas-Nebraska Act is. It's to start to organize this territory. It's a step to build this railroad, which is going to be the next step, and that's the real aim, getting the railroad built. Well, so the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and here it is, it organizes that had been that unorganized territory and turns it into the Kansas Territory and the Nebraska Territory. That's it. That's all it is. But Douglas runs into a problem. It seems like simple enough business, and it seems like everybody should be in favor of that, and who wouldn't be? Well, it turns out that lots of Southerners aren't in favor of it. It's not that they're opposed to it, it's that they want something in return. And they say to Douglas, look, if you want our votes for this thing, then you have to repeal the Missouri Compromise. So look at that line there, the Missouri Compromise line. Talked about it, I think, last lecture, the lecture before. It goes back to 1820, and the Missouri Compromise said that north of that line, there is not going to be allowed any slavery on all that purple area on the map. In other words, it's closed to slavery. Well, what the Southerners who are in the Senate say to Stephen Douglas about the Kansas-Nebraska Act is, look, if you want our vote, you got to repeal the Missouri Compromise. Now, nobody's expecting that there's going to be cotton plantations in North and South Dakota. It's in some ways it's a statement of principle more than anything else. But there are people who seem to think, well, slavery's successful in Missouri, particularly southern Missouri. Maybe we can have it work in southern Kansas as well. But in any case, that's the demand. Repeal the Missouri Compromise or forget about your bill. Well, Douglas is, he's a very able legislator, and he counts heads, and he thinks about who we can get votes from, and he thinks about how, what's he going to do to get his bill passed, and he finally comes to the conclusion that the Southerners are right. So he says, yep, okay, I need your vote, so I'm going to repeal the Missouri Compromise as part of this bill. And he doesn't think of it as much of a concession. This is Douglas's great. It's the political miscalculation of his life. He doesn't think of it as much of a concession because he says, look, who's going to have slaves in what's today, North and South Dakota and Nebraska? It's just not going to happen. So, I'm granting a theoretical concession for a real benefit. So, that's a good deal. Well, the country doesn't see it the same way as Douglas does. The Kansas-Nebraska Act becomes a huge lightning rod. Here's Senator William Seward of New York reacting to the Kansas-Nebraska Act as it passes. Come on then, gentlemen of the slave states, since there is no escaping your challenge, we accept it in the name of freedom. We will engage in competition for the virgin soil of Kansas, and God give the victory to the side which is stronger in numbers, in other words, higher population, as it is in right. In other words, the North is both right and has more people. If Kansas becomes theoretically open to slavery, we are going to fight you for it. And it turns out that this law is hugely controversial. Stephen Douglas becomes wildly unpopular among anti-slavery Northerners, and in the long run it ruins his chance to become president. Here's a great cartoon making that point. Forcing slavery down the throat of a free soiler. We have the poor slave being shoved into the mouth of the free soiler. And who's doing the shoving and holding down the guy? Well, Stephen Douglas, the one with the beard there, Franklin Pierce, President of the United States in 1854, James Buchanan, who will be president in 1856, and Lewis Cass. In other words, the leading lights of the Democratic Party are forcing slavery down the throats of Northerners. In other words, there is a slave power conspiracy, and it's this is the proof of it in the Democratic Party. Now, all four of these guys are Northerners. Douglas is from Illinois. He was born in Vermont. Pierce is from New Hampshire. Buchanan is from Pennsylvania. Cass is from Michigan. He was born in New Hampshire. So they're all Northerners. So why are they doing the bidding of slaveholders? Well, there's your proof of a slave power conspiracy. That's what Abraham Lincoln says in 1858 when he debates Douglas. He says, look, if all of these guys have been building a house together and they all came with perfectly designed parts of a house that fit together perfectly, wouldn't you say that they'd conspired to build the house, that they'd planned for it in advance? Well, when everything they do does the bidding of slaveholders, why don't you say the same thing about a slave power conspiracy? It's a powerful argument to a lot of voters in the 1850s. And they begin to see these Democratic politicians as at least beholden to a slave power conspiracy. Okay, what's the result in Kansas? Well, a disputed election and then an outbreak of open fighting in Kansas. This is Lawrence, Kansas, the capital of there are two capitals and two governments in Kansas for a while. Well, this is the capital of the anti-slavery faction. And it gets raided in May of 1856 and in part burnt. So this open fighting in Kansas, there are people getting killed in Kansas as a result of the dispute about slavery. There's another result, and that's in the United States Senate. A senator from Massachusetts named Charles Sumner is an anti-slavery Northerner, gets up and makes a speech called The Crime Against Kansas. And in this speech he says the crime against Kansas is essentially rape, that Kansas is being raped, like a virgin in the hands of a monster. And it's being raped by slavery. And in the course of Andrew Brooks, Brooks breaks his cane when he beats up Sumner, and receives thousands of new canes in the mail from Southerners who approve of his actions. Well, a United States Senator has been beaten up, and it takes Sumner years to recover from this beating, beaten up on the floor of the Senate for a speech he made attacking slavery. There's open fighting in Kansas. The anti-slavery capital, Kansas, has been attacked and burnt. How can you say there's no such thing as a slave power conspiracy? So more and more people become convinced of the slave power conspiracy through 1856. And you can see just from this image here that the ability of the United States Congress to do politics without open fighting breaking out is failing, that Congress is failing as an institution to do its job. It's no longer a deliberative body. It's an arena of radicalism and the inability to compromise, which means the inability to do politics in many ways. So the American system seems to be falling apart. Now, there's one other consequence of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act destroys the Whig Party. The Whig Party splits between Northerners and Southerners. Northern Whigs join with the Free Soilers. And the Free Soilers and they start a new party called the Republican Party. The Republican Party is an anti-slavery coalition. Now, this is the Republican Party's banner from 1856. You can see that it's a direct copy of the Free Soil banner we looked at in the last lecture. You've got the farmer at the bottom, Liberty, the eagle. It's the same damn thing. It's the same as the Liberty banner, the Free Soil banner from 1848 I showed you before. So the Republican Party is, in a sense, an expansion of the Free Soil Party. There's the Free Soil banner from 1848, and there's the Republican one from 1856. They're almost identical. Candidates are different, but that's about it. So this belief in a slave power conspiracy, this belief that politics is breaking down, this belief that Southerners have too much power, that slavery is dangerous, all of that becomes enshrined in the Republican Party. And the Republican Party's stated aim as a party is to prevent the expansion of slavery. It's a pro-Wilmot party, as the Free Soil Party had been. Here's some of their propaganda. The extension of slavery is the question not only of free soil, but over free men. Do you doubt it? Read the words of the highest authorities in the South. And they quote this Southern newspaper. Slavery is right, natural, and necessary. It does not depend upon the difference of complexion. The laws of the slave states justify the holdings of white men in bondage. And the Republicans are saying to the Northern voters, this is the future of your grandchildren unless you do something about slavery now. Here's some, this is a pro-Southern bit of propaganda, and this just shows how much the issue of slavery is embedded in all kinds of discourse in the United States in the 1850s. This is an ad for a bookbinding company. We always have on hand a supply of stock of the rarest quality, blah, blah, blah. But then listen to this, right in the middle of it. Authors and publishers of the South and West take notice that we, ready with our armor on to battle manfully for Southern rights. How? Well, by binding editions of books in muslin, plain, or gilt from 1,000 copies upwards. You know, it's just an ad, but they somehow work this question of Southern honor and Southern rights into this ad. These kind of discussions are inescapable in the 1850s. They're dominating politics just as the political system is failing. Congress isn't doing its job. There's fighting on the floor of Congress. One of the major parties has fallen apart. We've got this new party. This new party has no Southern presence at all. There's no such thing as a Southern Republican because the Republican Party is an anti-slavery party. It's entirely a Northern party. So the political system seems to be failing utterly in 1856. Well, the Democrats win the election of 1856. The Republicans, the Whigs cease to exist. The Republican Party is a new party and a regional one. And the Democrats win, and they elect James Buchanan, who we'd seen before. This is the kind of thing that the Democrats are saying about the Republicans. Who are the Republicans? So this is a Democratic version of the great Republican Reform Party calling on their candidate. Well, who do we see? Well, we see on the left a guy talking about tobacco, animal food, and lager beer. He wants to make all those things a capital crime. This kind of nutty reformer who's anti-slavery, and really just kind of not anti-slavery so much as he is in favor of every crazy reform that comes down the book. Then we have the crazy feminist, dressed like a man with her pantalons on and smoking. I mean, it's kind of shocking. Then we have a lazy bum who says an equal distribution of property is what I go for. Then we have this crazy spinster woman who's in favor of free love. We have the Catholic representing these dangerous Catholic immigrants, and then we have the black guy, and all of them are coming and forming the Republican Party together. And there is James Fremont, the presidential candidate of 1856 to the Republicans, promising them everything. So the Republican Party is a motley coalition of the craziest and most radical and reformers in America, as well as the most despised minorities, and it's completely un-American as far as the Democrats are concerned. What do they favor? Ultimately, they favor race mixing. The flower white womanhood here with all these black men. Here, on the other hand, is what the Republicans are saying about the Democratic platform. Beating of Charles Sumner there on the left, the burning of Kansas, and then slaves chained to the American flag, while they ask, is this democracy? And the Southerner responds, we will subdue you. Democratic Party is a party of force and slavery, and not a party of democracy. So this is the kind of rhetoric we've got in America by the mid-1850s. And the Civil War is not that far away. All right, that gets us to the Dred Scott decision. Democratic Party elects James Buchanan in 1856. He takes office in 1857, March of 1857. Okay, so Buchanan actually gets sworn into office in March of 1857, and that leads us to Dred Scott. Dred Scott was a slave in Missouri, and Dred Scott, his owner, had been an army officer, and at different points in his army career, Scott's owner took him to Illinois, to an army base in Illinois, which was a free state, and at another point to Wisconsin, which was free territory. And on the basis of these trips to different places that were free, Scott sued for his freedom. Now, he sued in Missouri, and the trials took place in state court and then in federal court and then in appeals courts, and had wound their way up to the Supreme Court. They'd been working their way through the court system for years, and coincidentally, the Supreme Court was ready to rule in the Dred Scott case in March of 1857. So there's James Buchanan, the new president. Buchanan had run on a platform saying that slavery should be an issue that Congress and the White House have nothing to say about, that the slave question should be resolved by the courts. And just a few days after he was inaugurated, the court was ready to make a ruling. That's the court in Missouri in which the Dred Scott case was first filed. And here you can see that he was illiterate. He put his mark there between the two words of his name. And here is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger Taney. Roger Taney was a Jackson appointee. He was from Maryland, which was a slave state. He was pro-slavery. And when the Dred Scott case became before the Supreme Court, Taney saw it as an opportunity to make a pro-slavery ruling. Now, the Supreme Court could have just kicked the case out and said Dred Scott had no standing, that is, no ability to sue, and court of the United States because he was a slave, and therefore they wouldn't have had to make a sweeping ruling. And that would have been the easy way out. But Tawney wanted a sweeping ruling, and he wanted a sweeping pro-slavery ruling, and that's what he got. In the Dred Scott case, the Supreme Court rules that Congress has no right to legislate slavery in the territories, that slaveholders have an absolute right to bring their slaves with them into any territory of the United States, and that basically the entire platform of the Republican Party is unconstitutional. This ruling, this absolutely sweeping pro-Southern victory, comes out just a couple of days after President Buchanan is nominated on a platform of saying, let the courts decide. Now, Buchanan was called a Northern man with Southern principles. He was from Pennsylvania, as I mentioned before. And the combination of this Buchanan election on this platform saying, the courts are going to take care of it, and then the court coming out with this incredibly sweeping pro-Southern ruling just mere days after the inauguration of the new president, for many, many people was the final proof of a slave power conspiracy. Despite their minority status, despite the fact that so many people disapproved of them, despite the fact that an entire party is devoted to stopping the expansion of slavery, nevertheless, the small minority of incredibly wealthy Southern slaveholders is ruling the Supreme Court and the White House. What could be more proof of a slave power conspiracy? By 1857, the entire country is divided along lines of irreconcilable differences. Huge proportions of Americans believe that there's either conspiracy against Northern liberty or conspiracy against Southern liberty, and they find ample proof of their positions in the politics of the day. We've got a breakdown of Congress's ability to compromise, and we have already fighting in Kansas and on the floor of the United States Congress, and the election of Lincoln in the election of 1860 is only going to further cement these opinions. In other words, by 1857 we're already well on the road to Civil War, and we'll deal with that in another lecture. So